Good afternoon. I'm Arthur Kennel, and I'm standing in for Roger Hurl, the chair of the Deming Lectureship Committee, who's not able to be here today. And I'd like to welcome you to the 2018 Deming Lecture. With me on the stage today are Lissa Levange, the president of the ASA, and John Elting, the recipient of this year's Deming Lectureship Award. Let's take a moment to recognize the parties that have made this lecture possible today. And I'd like you to focus on the last item in this list, the Friends of W. Edwards Deming. This is people like you and me who have recognized that our ASA regular membership dues support the basic operation of the ASA. But it's people who recognize the importance of additional giving to the ASA, who make it possible for things like this lecture and other outreach that the association is able to do. The Deming Award was established in 1994, so this is the 24th lecture. The award was created with three purposes in mind. First, to honor W. Edwards Deming, to celebrate his contributions to the statistical community and to society at large, and to recognize the accomplishments of an eminent statistician influenced by Deming. Here I can only list a few of Deming's major accomplishments. I think we all know that he made significant contributions in survey sampling and developed techniques that still underlie the way we do census and quality control today. In business and industry, he was a tireless advocate after World War II for quality control methods in both business and industry. And in management, he's perhaps best known to the largest number of people for his work in post-war Japan and his management seminars in the US that were attended by well over 100,000 people. And in the lecture today, John will touch on at least one of the key Deming contributions in this area. So let me say just a bit about John. There's so much one could say about John. He's currently Assistant Director for Research and Methodology at the U.S. Census Bureau. Previously, he was Associate Commissioner for Research Methods and for Survey Methods and Research at the BLS. He chairs the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, and he's an Associate Editor for both the American Statistician and JASA. He's past chair of the Washington Statistical Society and a past program chair for the JSM, and I think we should all be grateful to anyone who's been willing to serve as a chair of the JSM. We've all experienced just what a complicated operation that is just by virtue of attending sessions and being here. He's a fellow of the ASA, and last year he was the recipient of both the Roger Harriet Award for Innovation in the Federal Statistical System and the ASA Founders Award. Outlining his many contributions in publications and presentations would take far too long and take too much time from his presentation here. But finally, I would like to say just what a high level of esteem John enjoys from his colleagues within the statistical system, and for those of us who are no longer members of the federal statistical system. John, you're really a wonderful person and have affected so many people's lives and work in so many positive ways. So it's my very great personal pleasure to ask President Levange now to present the Deming Award plaque to John Elting. The inscription on the plaque reads, "This plaque is presented to John Elting for significant and numerous contributions to the advancement in philosophy and teachings of W. Edwards Deming." And now it's time for me to give you to John, who I'm confident will give a thought-provoking and insightful lecture. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Arthur. I'm very grateful to the Deming Memorial Lecture Committee for the opportunity to speak here today, and to the individuals and groups that are listed in the acknowledgement section. Who contributed so much to the development of the ideas that we'll be summarizing here. Even though I happen to be the person standing here, we'll be drawing, as you'll see, on many elements that have been worked on, developed by many people over the last several decades. I'm also very grateful to everybody in the audience for the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you over the next few minutes. We're going to begin with some general contextual comments on memorial lectures on Dr. Deming and on some fundamental issues of quality, plus a brief overview of his 14 points for management. That will lead to a discussion of quality and management issues that are crucial in the production and dissemination of statistical information products and services. And then we will explore these issues in some additional depth for the currently developing effort to integrate sample survey data with data from other sources. That discussion will lead to reconsideration of some of the fundamental concepts and principles that led to Dr. Deming's 14 points, and that, in turn, will lead to 14 questions that are centered on the linkage of stakeholder value with fundamental measures of quality, risk, and cost, on potential changes in management structure and function to help improve the balance of quality, risk, and cost in the integration of multiple data sources, and finally, the overarching importance of the human condition on Dr. Deming's work and in these possible extensions. First, a few words on context. We have memorial lectures to honor those in our profession who came before us, warts and all, and to honor the best of their work, and it is meet and right so to do. In honoring their contributions, we should remember the original context of that work and distinguish carefully between fundamentals, which endure, and the implementation details and accretion of practice, which naturally change with time and circumstances. And equally important, we explore practical ways in which to extend their original insights into new areas. That requires us to think in depth about both technical challenges and broader questions about societal conditions and impact. A second note of context is that, as with any historical figure, we need to think about Dr. Deming and his work within the context of his time. Just like all of us, Deming understood events through filters defined by his own prior experiences. He lived from 1900 to 1993, intersecting an era that was labeled by some as a statistical century. And many features of that era had an indelible effect on his work. These include the rapid growth of industry, corresponding changes in industrial organization, related needs to improve the quality of manufactured products, and controversies regarding the management of large-scale organizations. That same era saw dramatic changes in the size and scope of government and corresponding changes in the relationships among government, citizens, economy, and the field of science. And all of those changes can have important effects on the norms and the operational expectations, often unstated, regarding statistical information and its uses. So we'll say a few more words about that in the next few minutes. That leads to a third layer of context. Dr. Deming's decades at the interface between statistics and management led to a unique perspective that flowed primarily from his experiences with quality improvement in manufacturing, but was also informed heavily by his extensive experience with sample surveys, statistical auditing, and government operations. And consequently, he developed and articulated his unique perspective on management, in large part through the concepts of sampling variability, defined broadly to include control charts, as well as more complex sampling and experimental designs. And thus, much of his exposition was intended to focus management attention on practical action anchored in three fundamental concepts. First, determining whether a system is in a state of statistical control. Second, a realistic analysis of problematic outcomes as to whether they arose from special or common causes, respectively. And most important, directing an organization's efforts toward practical improvements in their system. That led to his books, Out of the Crisis and the New Economics, as well as other materials and lectures, and to succinct summaries of his views through his 14 points and a related system of profound knowledge. I would emphasize that taken as a whole, his books and lectures on management naturally touched on a very wide range of topics in statistical methodology and theory, as well as management, economics, social sciences, and related work at the interface of science, technology, and society. Many authors have written many books in these fields, and today we won't have much to add to those general studies. Instead, we're going to draw very selectively on some elements from those fields, and thus naturally leave out far more than we managed to put in. In particular, we're going to be exploring some features of these general issues that are flowing from the current changes in the environment for production, dissemination, and use of high-quality statistical information products and services. We're going to suggest that some of these changes have important parallels with the changes in industrial, economic, and social conditions encountered decades ago by Dr. Deming. And then we will apply underlying concepts from his 14 points and from the broader statistical field to propose 14 questions for our profession as a response to these opportunities and challenges. Now, in setting the context for this lecture, we have asserted that we're observing rapid changes in the environment for statistical information products and services. Here's a bit of further background on that. Rigorous statistical organizations, regardless of whether they're in government or academia or the private sector, generally have a mission that is centered on the production of high-quality statistical information on a sustainable and cost-effective basis. There's a lot packed into that very short mission statement, so we'll try to unpack that a bit in the next few minutes. First of all, the notions of quality, sustainability, and cost-effectiveness each involve multiple dimensions that require careful attention. In particular, our profession, including a lot of work that's going to be presented at the joint staff meetings this week, has devoted a very large amount of attention to the quality of statistical information. And we apply those concepts to a range of common products and services, including tabular products, graphs and maps, as well as microdata releases in appropriately protected forms, and in-depth modeling results. So instead of thinking about work that Dr. Deming emphasized, especially in his last few decades, for example, quality of automobiles or electronics or perhaps medical care, we're going to be talking today about the quality of these statistical products, very much in keeping with a large amount of Dr. Deming's earlier work. Now, over many decades, the needs of our stakeholders who need and use statistical information products and services, have led to the development of specialized units. We'll generically call these rigorous statistical organizations that seek to fulfill our mission that is centered again on quality, sustainability, and cost effectiveness. And that in turn has led to strong expectations regarding transparency and also to the development of a very strong institutional culture centered on objectivity, professionalism, scientific rigor, and a realistic balance in addressing the needs of many of our stakeholders. And that culture of objectivity and professionalism has a crucial impact on decisions about the space in which a rigorous statistical organization may seek to operate and on how we operate within that space. Now, that's in very brief form the current state of nature. But within the ecosystem that's been developed for the production and use of high-quality statistical information, we are currently experiencing major changes. And three notable examples are the perceived increase in the availability of so-called non-design data, or more broadly, multiple data sources. These include traditional and novel forms of sample surveys, as well as administrative records, commercial transaction information, social media traces, imagery, and streams from the Internet of Things. A second major component are changes in the scope, sophistication, and utility of a wide range of methodological and technological tools. Many people here in the audience have made wonderful contributions in that area. Third, we're also seeing major changes in stakeholder expectations regarding privacy, also regarding the cross-sectional and temporal granularity of the statistical information products and services that we provide. And finally, the applicability of this information in high-priority work in the private sector and in government. Those are a whole lot of changes, and as is often observed for large-scale changes, that overnight event has been decades in the making. And furthermore, these changes within our statistical environment are emerging within a broader context defined by societal reconsideration of the nature of information, including but not limited to statistical information. That reconsideration includes the connection between stakeholder value with outcome measures like quality, risk, cost, credibility, accountability, and access. Also includes reconsideration of resource allocation, including both the amount and the type of societal resources that are devoted to production of statistical information, and the mechanisms by which those resources are allocated. And finally, we're also seeing changes in the perception of the nature of public goods. All of those are important, broad societal context within which we're carrying out our work. And a productive response to those changes is going to require us to look and carry out an extensive amount of work, and first of all, extending, sometimes perhaps in unexpected directions, an already rich body of research and practice. It's also going to require us to carry out reinvestments in several areas in serious, sustained, and carefully targeted basis. It's also going to require us to reaffirm and apply some core values of data quality and integrity. So, to get some traction on this proposed response, stated so far in very broad general terms, we need to dig deeper into questions about the integration of multiple data sources. Here are a couple of examples. Some of these are relatively modest, like efforts to link survey data with unit-level administrative or commercial records. We'll call that example A as a mnemonic for appending administrative or commercial data to a sample survey. A good example of this comes from a Committee on National Statistics report from a few years ago, which explored a wide range of topics, including the possibility of taking the current design for the Consumer Expenditure Survey and appending certain types of commercial transaction information to individual household level or consumer level information that we have. And for those cases, the goals generally center on reduction of costs and improvement of quality. Other examples include so-called backbone and bridge methods that start with one or more administrative record sets and then supplement that information with sample surveys to provide calibration information. A classic example of that that's been around for many decades is the current employment survey conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It takes an administrative record set based on unemployment insurance records provided by the 50-plus states in the United States and appends to that a sample survey designed to collect more contemporaneous, more recent information regarding both employment counts and recent recipiency of wages. So that's an example of a backbone and bridge type of survey. We're seeing opportunities for many other types of designs along the same lines. In addition, it's arguable that much of the work for small domain estimation over the last several decades also fits under this rubric of backbone and bridge designs. Now, all of those cases can be really exciting. It involves a lot of very rich information, really rich opportunities for research, and also very good opportunities to provide additional information to our key stakeholders. But to make productive use of those opportunities, we need to have a systematic approach for the evaluation and integration of these sources based on three main ideas. First, we need to look very carefully at multiple dimensions of performance as measured through quality, risk, and cost. Second, we need to extend customary definitions of design to provide a systematic approach to improving these performance measures. And finally, it's useful to align these steps with Deming's notions of statistical control and common and special causes for the degradation of quality that may take place or degradation of other measures of performance. So that's a broad idea. We're going to be developing those ideas in a little bit more detail in the next few minutes. But before we do so, suggest that we spend a couple of minutes looking at this highly idealized graph. And then we'll be anchoring several of the ideas we have in the next few minutes in this graph. Along the vertical axis, we have a measure, we're labeling it P, for our performance measures. These would be our measures of quality, risk, and cost that I referenced a moment ago, that we'll be talking about in greater depth. Then we're going to be thinking about these performance measures as functions of a variable z, this will be reflecting environmental factors, and a second set of variables that we'll label X that are going to represent a set of design decisions that we end up making. Now, each of these labels, P, Z, and X, in fact represent some very high dimensional vectors. But for purposes of display here, we're thinking about each one of those as just being one dimensional. And furthermore, we'll spend some time thinking about the corresponding surface that we have here, in this case displayed in a really nice, pristine quadratic form. Now, our field has studied performance issues as captured by the graph that we had on the last slide in a somewhat heterogeneous form. Our profession has spent a lot of time studying some dimensions of quality and generally is settled on a multi-dimensional definition of quality that includes several qualitative features like timeliness and relevance, but also includes quantitative features that generally fall under the rubric of accuracy. And that accuracy dimension generally has operational definitions centered on extensions of so-called total survey error models, includes measures like population coverage and linkage quality. And for any given dimension of quality that we're considering, could be anything in quality and or risk or cost, it's good to distinguish carefully between an indicator variable for a specific degradation event that may take place. For example, missingness of a given observation J for a specific population unit I. And on the other hand, the resulting aggregate impact that such a class of events has on estimator performance, like inflation of a mean squared error of an estimator that we'll call theta hat. We'll see in a few minutes that that distinction can be useful as we think about connections between specific dimensions of quality and the general quality approach espoused by Dr. Deming. In addition to quality, there are at least two other dimensions of performance that warrant consideration, risk and cost. For the current discussion of risk, we'll emphasize specific system-level failure events that degrade the overall sustainability of our production. In traditional sample survey settings, these examples of such events would include failures in programming of a data collection instrument, or violation of disclosure protections, or break-in-series phenomena. And in work with integration of multiple data sources, we still worry about all of those types of events, but we also worry about other events. For example, the loss of or undetected change in one or more administrative or commercial data sources that we may be trying to use. And for indicators of events like these, we can consider modeling the resulting risk through hazard functions, accounting for prospective predictor variables. And finally, statistical organizations also spend a lot of time thinking about cost. For traditional surveys, we're accustomed to examining multiple dimensions of cost, like cash expenditures or respondent burden. And for integration of multiple data sources, we also need to think in depth about additional expenditures for the capture and integration of administrative and commercial sources, and for contingencies in risk management. So that's a summary of our performance measures: quality, risk, and cost. That's the vertical axis that we had on the graph we considered a moment ago. And each of those measures can be affected by a wide range of environmental factors that we can observe but cannot control. We'll use Z as a general label for those environmental factors, and that's the second dimension that we saw in these graphs. A good example of this that's important for cases like example A are appending administrative or commercial data to sample survey data, arise when we think about widely reported patterns of degradation in public trust and the resulting impact that may have on the willingness of a given either business or household or individual to provide consent to link their survey responses to their corresponding administrative or commercial data. When we're integrating multiple data sources, we do have to worry a lot about these environmental factors, perhaps even more than we do when we're thinking about sample surveys. But we are not entirely at the mercy of our environment, and we can expect that we can control some features of our process of data capture, integration, and dissemination. In particular, within the survey context, our field has studied this for decades under the rubric of design. And our general approach has been to seek to optimize or at least improve a specific quality measure, often conditional upon cost constraints. The granddaddy of them all in terms of this type of approach, involves P equal to a sampling error variance, and it seeks to improve that variance through modification of design features, for example, stratum boundaries or sampling rates. In addition, survey methodologists consider performance measures P based on non-sampling error and its effect on bias and mean squared error, and seeks improvement through instrument design or mode choice. Now, that's for surveys. For the integration of multiple data sources, it can be useful to extend previous notions of survey design to characterize a wide class of design decisions as a full set of resource allocation decisions that account for observable environmental factors, or Z terms, and also deliver a specified level of performance as characterized by our multiple measures of quality, risk, and cost. And we carry that out with efforts that are focused on information and estimation of a specific parameter vector theta that's intended to inform a particular user group. So we're going to be thinking about targeted resource allocation and use that as our broad definition of design. And in doing so, it's important to bear in mind that high-quality statistical work is an inherently capital-intensive business where almost all of the capital in question is intangible capital. Some examples of these capital investments include the selection and use of specific data sources, the development and application of specific forms of methodology and technology defined broadly, the implementation of that methodology and technology through the development, testing, and maintenance of production systems, and equally important, carefully focused research and development to improve all of the cases that I've just mentioned. So, we spent the last few minutes thinking about the graph that I displayed a few minutes ago and covering a lot of moving parts. So we need to go ahead and pull those all together here. We have an operating space that's defined by a certain vector of target parameters theta. That's the first part of our operating space. And that's accompanied by a specified set of data users who have a certain value function. It's going to depend on established measures of quality, risk, and cost. So in a schematic form, we will say that our value that we're delivering to our stakeholders, V, is going to be some kind of function G of, again, these high-dimensional measures of quality, risk, and cost. Some kind of parameter gamma that we can think about as well, and some kind of deviation or error term also. And furthermore, we believe that our performance measures are functions of environmental variable Z that we observe but do not control, and also their function of a design vector X that reflects all of the resource allocation decisions that I described a few minutes ago. Now, as we think about this schematic model, we need to emphasize the term schematic. In many cases, we will never have enough data to estimate the parameters gamma of the model, nor to assess the goodness of fit of that model as such. And consequently, we're very well advised to exercise a considerable level of humility in assessment of available empirical information. Now, that aligns with other views in this field. For example, Phil Cott likes to say that we should walk humbly with our data, and I heartily agree. And there are also similar comments in their final report of the Commission of Evidence-Based Policymaking that came out last December, and numerous other authors over the years, and I've cited a couple of them here. But nonetheless, I believe it's worthwhile to consider such models in ways that I'll describe in the next few minutes, and to think about our potential capacity to capture and use some empirical information that may inform management decisions on quality, risk, and cost in a structured way. Now, subject to that cautionary note, we're going to try to connect our performance measures, quality, risk, and cost, with the fundamental design and environmental variables X and Z that we defined in broad form a moment ago. We're going to do that through a function F that also depends on a set of parameters beta, as well as a term E that reflects residual effects that are neither controlled nor observed directly. A classic example from sample surveys would involve variance function expressions that we're accustomed to seeing in traditional textbooks, as well as generalized variance functions that are often used both for estimation work and also in some cases for design improvement. So that brings us back to the same graph that we considered before. Again, along the vertical axis, we have our performance measures P. Along one of the other axes, we have Z, our environmental variables that we hope we can observe but cannot control. And finally, we have our variables X, our design characteristics that we believe we have a higher degree of control over. And as we consider that graph, we have a set of qualitative questions related to the corresponding function that we need to think about. First of all, what does this graph look like? I presented an idealized case where it's really nice and quadratic. Furthermore, if you stare at those graphs in further depth, you'll see that I'm effectively saying that the effects of X and Z are independent, no interactions between them. That would be a really nice world to live in, if we could live there. We would have this very nice stable bowl, and we think we know something, if we could estimate that surface, know something about how to go about optimizing that. Maybe we live in that nice world, or maybe you live in a world that is not so nice. For example, perhaps instead of having this nice, gentle bottom of that bowl, therefore something relatively easy to optimize, or at least come close, maybe at the bottom we have a very sharp ridge or trough. Similarly, maybe we don't have very nice, simple main effects related to X and Z. Maybe we live in a very bumpy, messy world with an awful lot of high-order interactions. Furthermore, maybe our life is even more complicated because we may have very severe constraints on some of our design factors X. And furthermore, maybe we know what those design factors X are, or maybe in fact they themselves are effectively stochastic in nature. And consequently, the best we may be able to do is come up with some kind of prediction for where that constraint is at a given time, and perhaps is going to be for an extended period of time after that. In addition, the graph that we had a moment ago was really nice and smooth. I wasn't displaying any kind of dispersion around the center points on the graph. What kind of predictive quality do we have? In other words, what values do we have for some kind of R-square, other measure of goodness of fit? And if it's less than desirable in terms of the quality of fit, can we go out and find additional predictor variable Z, additional understanding of our environmental factors that may be affecting the performance of these procedures to improve the quality of that fit? If so, is it worth doing that? In addition, we need to reconsider the design variables X themselves. Do we really think that we can control them perfectly? Often, one of the most fascinating phenomena, if we go out and talk with our field operations people, currently for sample surveys, and to some degree thinking about work with integration of multiple sources, they will frequently tell you about their concerns, again, both for sample surveys and for integration of multiple sources, about effectively slippage that we have between our nominal idealized control variables as we have set them and what we really have in operational practice. We need to understand more about that if we possibly can. And finally, the underlying premise that we have for all of this work with thinking about some kind of performance surface is essentially optimization. And the problem is, over the last few minutes, I hope I've persuaded you that in fact, an attempt to carry out optimization in a full-scale way here is by its nature fundamentally ill-defined, essentially an ill-posed problem stated in mathematical terms. And consequently, we're going to have to satisfy ourselves with looking at essentially well-defined and well-justified sub-problems and trying to solve those. Effectively, we have to carry out an exercise of conditioning on elements of P, our performance measure, for example, cost, or certain elements related to X and Z. Something we've done with sample surveys for many decades, for example, trying to minimize the variance with respect to cost. Same thing we need to do here, but now in a much higher dimensional way. And in doing that, we need to think in a lot of depth, not just about the mathematical tractability of the resulting conditions and their impact on optimization question, but we also need to think in a lot of depth about whether in fact the resulting conditions, the resulting constraints we're imposing on that problem are in fact consistent with realistic options for practice. And in parallel with that, the extent to which we can actually carry these out on a full-scale production mode. We need to be able to articulate that very clearly both to ourselves but also with our key stakeholders. Okay. Now, one final point regarding design. We need to connect the schematic models that we've been thinking about the last few minutes with traditional notions of statistical control and the distinction between common and special causes. In particular, when we have one specific bad outcome that has occurred, like a high missingness count or a cost overrun, we need to ask whether we can reasonably attribute that to common causes, for example, associated with inherent variability, essentially low R-square values that we had, or poor model fit that we have for our conceptual performance surface, or slippage in X, or changes in our environmental variable Z. Can we attribute the performance issue that we just identified to one or more of those sources? That can help us to diagnose and perhaps improve the system. In addition, we need to connect these models with general notions of continuous improvement through improvements, for example, in control over one or more of our nominal design factors, or perhaps by changing our design X in a way that effectively moves us to a better point on our performance surface that we have. In addition, any kind of planning for continuous improvement requires discussion of the pace at which these changes may be taking place, both in terms of their consideration and in terms of their implementation, and the extent to which these changes may flow from formal adaptive or responsive procedures. Okay. So that tells us a little bit about our performance measures, quality, risk, and cost, and about a notion of design that may try to incorporate that in a systematic way, specifically with reference to integration of multiple data sources. That gives us a conceptual framework then to develop 14 questions related to the integration of multiple data sources. And these questions align with fundamental issues that led to Dr. Deming's original 14 points. And in the summary that we have on the slide here, I've placed those points roughly into 3 groups with some conceptual and expository overlap among them. The first group involves systematic approaches to link stakeholder value with quality, risk, cost, and continuous improvement. The second group of questions involves using the framework that we just developed to improve management structure and function for this purpose. And third is a set of questions related to the human condition in all of its complexity and the impact that it has on how we go about trying to carry out these plans. Now, the first question centers on and pulls together the concepts that we've developed in the last few minutes while reviewing an idealized multidimensional performance surface. So we're asking about the extent and ways in which we may be able to characterize, measure, model, and control stakeholder value and its linkage with realistic measures of quality, risk, and cost. And in like way, the linkage that we may have of quality, risk, and cost measures with specific design factors and environmental factors. For example, we'll take the first of these cases, the connection of value with quality, risk, and cost. A few moments ago, we noted that example A, appending data, offers the prospect for reduced cost or burden and improved mean squared error. And for a given application, it's important to assess whether these improvements truly are realized, and if so, whether they're large enough to convey substantial value. Is it really worth the effort? Similarly, for the value conveyed through production of more granular estimates in example B. In that context, it's worthwhile to go back to what I acknowledged a moment ago. We often don't know much about the formal data that we have underlying these phenomena. It's worthwhile to think about cases in which we might try utility or prior elicitation methods developed within a Bayesian framework and see about the extent to which that may offer additional insights into these questions. In addition, as we explore this issue, we need to borrow a page from economists. If we're going to talk about value, we need to think about a distinction between so-called use value and option value, respectively. Use value is the value that's obtained from a specific, well-defined use, in this case of statistical information. A classic example would be use of the Consumer Price Index produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That information is used very heavily in the United States for adjustment of Social Security payments on an annual basis, and is also used literally for hundreds of billions of dollars worth of contracts and the related inflation riders within those contracts. So that's an example of very concrete use value. I get this information, here's how I plug it in, here's how I use it. Option value, on the other hand, is viewed as the present value that we attribute to a specific possible future use, in this case, again, of statistical information. And for our cases, that can include value that we have from estimation for special variables or special subpopulations. And it also may flow from specific statistical properties like the robustness of our procedures against model failure or outliers. We do not necessarily know whether a given type of model failure is or is not present in a given case, but it's very comforting to be able to tell ourselves and to tell our key stakeholders that in fact we have procedures that are robust against this type of model failure. And I'd suggest that much of the societal value of sophisticated methodology flows from variance on that option value. And so we need to think in depth about ways to articulate that idea in a way that's going to resonate with our key stakeholders. Now, that's the first question. The next three questions center on practical work with quality, risk, and cost, in keeping with the general framework that we outlined earlier in this lecture. And the final question in this first section goes back to potential effects the uncontrolled environmental factor Z may have on our performance profiles. So at the interface that we have between statistics and management, we need to explore practical ways to lead statistical organizations in a way that's robust and adaptable in light of these changing conditions. For example, in both examples A and B that we reviewed a moment ago, how do we go about fostering an institutional culture that encourages everybody to evaluate and respond to, in a constructive way, leading indicators of change in some of our key environmental variables Z? And how do we explore critical features of our performance profiles in a neighborhood of Z? How do we understand what may be changing with Z, and if so, how it might be having an effect on our performance measures? The questions in the second group explore the extent and ways in which we might use the preceding framework to produce fundamental improvements in management structure and function, again for the purpose of integrating multiple sources. These questions flow from the observation that even the best designed systems do not run on autopilot. And that is definitely the case for both sample surveys and for the integration of multiple data sources. They always require a substantial degree of management engagement and judgment. And the practical questions, the crucial ones we need to explore, is exactly where and how we should be carrying out that engagement. In particular, question 6 revisits the notions of intangible capital we used in the extended definition of design. For example, in the backbone and bridge example B, statistical organizations often invest substantial time in negotiations with prospective data sources. That time is essentially an investment in intangible capital, and it may or may not produce a return on investment in a given case. In addition, we encounter a plethora of special challenges related to intellectual property, another form of intangible capital. As a complement to question 6 on intangible capital, question 7 centers on the preferred organizational structure that we have to ensure timely and efficient information flow and operation control. In other words, question 6 asks about intangible capital. Question 7 asks about how do we use it. This aligns with Dr. Deming's emphasis on breaking down barriers. And for the integration of multiple data sources, it's crucial to think through the comparative advantage conveyed by specific skills and information bases and control mechanisms. And we need to ask whether the preferred structure may change as the predominant body of methodology and technology matures and standardizes. Idealized organizational structure that may be appropriate in working with a highly fragile, still developing body of methodology technology is not necessarily the same as the ideal structure that we may have after we have a certain body of methodology and technology that's relatively well standardized. Next question pulls together the previous two questions, looking at intangible capital, looking at control mechanisms and information flow, and it looks at incentives. How do we, in fact, have everybody work together through the structures that we have in place? In his point 11 and elsewhere, Dr. Deming had a very strong critique of quotas and management by numbers. And much of that critique arose from his objection to what he viewed as a naive focus on specific outcomes by many managers. He highlighted the resulting counterproductive behaviors and the impact on morale. And he emphasized that these problems distract from the fundamental leadership task of improving the underlying system. And so question 8 asks about ways in which to ensure that our explicit and implicit incentives and related management processes are consistent with long-term success and realistic integration of multiple sources. For instance, in both examples A and B, for appending data and for our backbone and bridge approach, statistical groups often wrestle with efforts to develop shared software for crucial tasks like entity resolution and imputation. Those are very challenging trade-offs that we have to deal with when we're trying to have a unified system that's going to meet several sets of stakeholder needs. We need to think in depth about how we incentivize participants to work through realistic trade-offs for decisions of that nature. An additional management control question flows from the fact that all of the changes that we reviewed at the start of this talk naturally lead to corresponding changes in culture, how all of our stakeholders work together. That fits very broadly with Dr. Deming's statements about pride and workmanship, and also fits with a wonderful paper by Don Dillman on the contrast between research and operational cultures in large-scale statistical organizations. So that's the second class of questions. The third class of questions, Dr. Deming had an acute concern for the human condition and often noted that problems of people can dominate essentially all aspects of management, including aspects that are nominally technical. And it's especially important to remember that idea in our current work with multiple data sources. And that's because human beings can be both highly creative and also highly contentious, especially when they are working at the intersection of representative government and free markets and multiple professional fields and rapidly changing economic, social, and technological conditions. Exactly the environment that we're encountering when we're thinking about the integration of multiple data sources. These issues arise in discussion of training, and we especially need to consider realistic approaches to training in new areas of methodology, technology, and data sources, and ensuring that that training is carried out in a way that ensures smooth integration with substantive knowledge and legacy operations. For example, if we have a colleague with very deep expertise in the substance of health survey data, to what extent should we expect them to receive substantial training in methods for linkage of their survey data with electronic health records? In a perfect world, everybody would be trained in everything, but in reality, we have to think about trade-offs in terms of how we allocate work and then how we develop skills to accomplish various parts of that work. These questions on training also extend to broader questions regarding education and self-improvement. We need to ask about the practical steps that a high-quality statistical organization can take to help all colleagues thrive as professionals in this changing environment. And that amounts to taking a very intentional focus on human capital investments. Now, another dimension in the human condition centers on leadership. Dr. Deming spent a lot of time talking about leadership, and his critiques of standard management approaches reflected a fundamental view that he had that humans and society and markets and organizations are all profoundly imperfect, but that they can improve, and that both technical and managerial leadership bear a special responsibility for that improvement and for humility in carrying out those efforts. And consequently, we need to ask about the characteristics that are most important in managerial and technical leadership of a rigorous statistical organization. For example, in both examples A and B that we developed before, we especially need leadership in developing a consensus regarding expectations for our profiles of quality, risk, and cost. And I know many people in this audience have spent hours in meetings effectively working through debates among our colleagues on exactly those topics. It's also really important for us to think about navigating a very careful distinction between core values, those that we need to focus on and enhance, and on the other hand, details of practice, which naturally are going to change with corresponding changes in our methodological, technological, and data source environment, and which we need to understand, manage, and communicate. And in doing so, it's crucial to take a positive sum approach. And finally, we operate in the public space. This is regardless of whether we are in the government as such, or in academia, or in the private sector. And our statistical information products and services often disseminate as public goods. They're intended for non-exclusive use by a very wide range of stakeholders. In some cases, use of multiple data sources may lead us to reconsider some public goods premises. Bob Groves and his co-authors have touched on this discussion of data with their discussion of data philanthropy. And this also has broader implications for the expectations of our data users and related two-way communication. So in closing, we have three general conclusions. First, the current expansion of scientifically rigorous statistical information products and services is truly an exciting opportunity. In particular, expanded work with the integration of multiple sources opens the space for a wide range of groundbreaking methodological and technological work that's covered in depth in many sessions in this conference and in many other scientific forums. And this lecture has suggested that the development and application of that scientific work will require in-depth exploration of a wide range of quality and management topics considered previously by Dr. Deming. And that idea has led to 14 questions on management. Those questions have suggested that in managing the development and production of high-quality statistical information products and services, we need to be very intentional about data users and uses, building on the fundamental concept of fitness for use. We also need to be thinking about balancing complex profiles of quality, risk, and cost. We need to have a very careful focus on what we know and what we don't know from available empirical information. In addition, we need to think about practical implementation of this technical work and recognize that that practical implementation requires us to think in depth about the role of leadership. And finally, in any discussion of management, at the beginning, middle, and end, we need to think very long and hard about the human condition as lived individually and in community. Our value systems, relationships, passions, joys, creativity, sorrows, gratitude, dignity, and grace. Thank you.
So I think we have, don't go away, John, because we have time for questions, and so I think I'll let you manage the questions.
Sounds good. Okay, and a couple of points on logistics. There are some microphones in the audience. Please be sure to go ahead and use those microphones. This is being recorded. That will ensure both that everybody in the audience and those who are subsequently watching online are able to hear your questions. Also ensures that I'll be able to hear your question as well.
Hi. Perhaps I'll volunteer one to get us started and break the ice. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I'll direct the question towards one of the latest points in your talk. What about if your leadership in the organization has never heard about Deming or his insightful thoughts on management?
Yep.
How would you go about, approaching these kinds of situations when the leadership is not engaged to the same level of thought that you have just described?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And this ties in with the general question of institutional culture that we touched on very briefly, but in principle would warrant an entirely separate talk by itself. There was an absolutely fascinating phenomenon in the United States, largely in the 1980s and to some degree continuing in the 1990s, when especially in terms of certain types of durables manufacturing, perhaps most prominently in the automobile industry, there was a great deal of attention devoted to Dr. Deming and his presentations regarding quality management in those types of settings. That's continuing at present with a lot of continuing attention in certain areas. That also affected the government at the same time. There were a number of discussions within many government statistical agencies and others about that. Part of what you're touching on is a really interesting transition when you have somebody who is effectively integrating ideas, distilling ideas from a wide range of settings and expressing them as Dr. Deming was. And then saying, how do you go about, in fact, institutionalizing that type of behavior and attitude that he was advocating for? And how do you have that continuing on a sustainable basis? I know just enough how to ask that question, other than the fact that we need to keep emphasizing that this isn't just a matter of saying this is something that's been asserted and we should follow it, but instead understanding that in fact this is reflecting some fundamental needs of our organization. It's essentially a systematic way of understanding that. So it's very much worthwhile, but tie it in with the utility function, tie it in with essentially the specific needs of that organization. Question?
Hi, John. I'm John Aboud. I have better access to John Elting than most of you, but I know he has a good answer to these questions, so I thought I'd give him the opportunity to share it with all of you. I've noticed that you very much like to use the language of economics when you're talking about the management of statistical systems. And I particularly noticed that you often refer to intangible capital as the asset that the organization needs to manage most carefully. I'm wondering what in your long experience in the statistical system led you to that way of looking at the challenges that the statistical system faces.
That's also another hour worth of response right there. Touch on just a couple of points. One is that a fascinating phenomenon, to some degree it's true for most US statistical agencies, and it's also true to some degree for organizations in other countries or in the private sector or academia. There is a substantial degree to which many, not all of those organizations, operate effectively on a cash basis. And consequently, when we encounter budget reductions, there is an internal debate that will naturally take place within the organization about saying, how do we take our limited resources, many of which have extremely high fixed costs attached to them, and how do we end up taking those resources and ensuring that we're able to maintain both current production, our commitments that we've made to our external stakeholders, and also invest for the future. If you have a relatively static environment, then you don't really have that much of a debate. You can pretty much continue to do what you were doing last year, and if that worked out pretty well, that may be okay. Once you have two things taking place, one is, again, a budget reduction. The second one is that you end up seeing a dramatic change in the external environment, as we spent last hour talking about here. Suddenly, you end up saying, I can no longer just stay on autopilot. I can no longer pretty much cut and paste from what my activities, my budget plans, my other management activities were for previous years. And you have to think about, well, how are we going to end up continuing this in a way that the organization can thrive in depth? And pretty quickly, you end up saying what is a cliche, but nonetheless, it's a cliche because it's really true. Your primary assets are your people. And it can be, and there can be temptations in a given year to say, okay, we'll just underinvest. We know it's not a good idea in the long run, but we can go ahead and just hold on for a year, maybe 2 years or something like that. In fact, you end up seeing deterioration because people aren't keeping up at that point. So those are important cases, but only in a very broad summary form. The other question is to look at individual careers. And I can think about many people who are here in this audience and appreciate your being here. And you end up saying, well, in a formal sense, that individual is employed by some organization, might be, again, government, academia, private sector. They walk in on a given day, and an accounting form at the end of that day, the end of the week, the end of the month, indicates that person did this work and they were paid this amount. That's not really what's going on in terms of what they contributed to the organization, what they contributed to particular projects. Those individuals are drawing on essentially a base of human capital that in many cases has been invested for decades and decades. And you look at leading figures. One was Dr. Deming. Other ones are other people we honor with other memorial lectures, for example, Morris Hansen. And you say, what was their impact on the field? Well, often they made contributions in at least two areas. One is they made specific intellectual contributions. For example, improving theorems, developing a system of thinking about things, in some sense what we can write down. But the other thing that you will see many of those individuals do is that they made enormous investments in their colleagues. Might have been peers, might have been people who were relatively new in the field. And you can often trace the career trajectories of those individuals. It was good for their careers, but equally important, the contributions that they made to their organizations over the course of time. If you tried to think about that, going back to what John was asking, if you try to think about that in some kind of quasi-economic way, you essentially would say that that person, that mentor from years ago, made an enormous investment in intangible capital in the individuals that we're thinking about. And then they're essentially getting a huge yield, and they, meaning themselves, but also the organizations they work with, all the other stakeholders who benefit from their work. They're essentially getting an enormous yield out of that over literally decades. That's what I've observed over the course of time. When I ask questions, I was saying about how do we get people to thrive? How do we set up an environment in which individuals can thrive over time? That is in some sense an extraordinarily utilitarian and selfish question, but nonetheless one we really have to ask, because it's enormously important for the health of the organization and the individuals and all of the other stakeholders to whom we're trying to contribute, for us to make those investments. So we benefit enormously by ensuring that in fact all of our colleagues in our organization thrive. So that's what I think about when I think about intangible capital and human capital investments.
Hi, John. Rob Santos.
Hi, Rob.
Yeah. I had a question. I'm not quite sure how you, whether you want to answer this one, but first of all, thank you for the excellent lecture or the presentation and the great framework that you laid out. There's a little bit of, what do you call it? Feedback, yeah. Is this better? Yeah.
I think it's not too bad, so go ahead, please.
Okay, good. So I really like the notion of fit for purpose and the framework you laid out in terms of creating a value proposition, or fit for use, actually. There can be situations, and I can think of at least a couple in different agencies, including the Census Bureau, where one may not have the resources available given the current social and even policy environment to establish the value that historically has been needed for certain products, like the 2020 census. How can the framework be used to help address those types of situations where you have, you know, environmental impact, you have social, you know, issues going on, et cetera? Can your framework be used to sort of address a situation where you may not be able to get the type of quality that you think is needed?
Okay, it's a good question. Let me answer it in several different layers. First of all, sometimes when we look back at the past, we say, golly, things were nice back in the past. They were so much better than now. I've been hearing that now for about 58 years. And I'll probably be hearing it for the rest of my life. We always look back and we think the world is simpler maybe back then than it is now. So I'd really suggest that regardless of a particular era that we're in, we always need to be able to communicate. We always need to be able to articulate to the extent that we possibly can the very complex trade-offs we have. And we need to acknowledge, in fact, for all of our stakeholders, that in fact we are wrestling with some very complex trade-offs. Furthermore, go back to what I was saying about use value and option value. In many cases, if you have somebody asking, well, can't we just do something a little bit less? Often they are thinking in very concrete ways about use value as such. And we need to be sure to have a conversation that, in fact, has everybody think about both use value and option value. I'll give you an example. How many people here know why the US developed a consumer price index? Anybody? Originally, 1917. Okay, we've got an economist who raised his hand. Anybody else? Okay. The reason that the United States developed a consumer price index was because of shipbuilding contracts during World War I. The shipbuilding organizations, naturally shipyards, were in certain locations. They did an enormous amount of hiring. Guess what happened? People came in, they put an enormous amount of stress on housing and other services in those areas, and as a result of that, the cost of living went up dramatically in those shipbuilding areas. Those contractors then went back to the United States government and said, we have to raise our wages, therefore we need you to pay us more for those ships for which we already wrote a firm fixed price contract. The United States government at that point said, okay, we hear you, but we need evidence to in fact support that. And consequently, they ended up developing a consumer price index, specifically focused for the, at the start on relatively small number of areas in which this type of shipbuilding activity was taking place. If you were the commissioner, the acting commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics now, and you went to the Office of Management and Budget in the United States Congress or the media and said the consumer price index is enormously important because of shipbuilding contracts, you'd get at best blank looks. But in fact, you say, wait a minute, what's happened over time? As I said, we have now some very specific use value attached to consumer price index, inflate Social Security, which didn't even exist back in 1917, as well as all these other contracts that have been embedded in it. As a result of that, many people end up taking an approach, it's true much more broadly in terms of many areas of technology, but specifically for this type of statistical methodology and statistical products. The language that they use is, quote, if you build it, they will come. The idea is, harking back to the Field of Dreams movie from 30-some years ago, if in fact you have a high-quality product out there, and almost always you have to have that anchored in at least one very concrete use value. Again, the shipbuilding contracts in 1917. And if you also have a very intentional process of trying to understand what those other potential option values are, work with those stakeholders, understand what you may need to do, for example, to expand this set of statistical products and services to meet those additional needs based on that core, based on that backbone that we have the original use. That's one of the key ways in which we can try to expand that. That's again, regardless of whether you're thinking about something produced by the government as such, or an academic unit, or a private sector organization. But you have to be very intentional about thinking about that. You need to be able to articulate, again, both current use value and prospective option value. And that requires people to have a very deep understanding of what your users are. How exactly do they use those data? What kind of level of quality do they need? It may be surprising. Maybe they need less than we think. Maybe they need much more. How do we end up having an in-depth, very intentional two-way conversation for that? Absolutely crucial for us to do that, and that's something that we need to do much more of. ASA and many other organizations, I think, have done a very admirable job over the last couple of decades. For example, statistical literacy and other work like that, in trying to build a base for that and have many stakeholders, in fact, are much more sophisticated than they might have been several decades ago in terms of understanding what our data products are. But we need to take that a step further and have both a set of processes, but also an underlying institutional culture in which we have that ongoing conversation so people truly understand what are we delivering, what can they reasonably expect. And again, since I was trained originally in mathematical statistics, I have a very selfish view of saying let's especially look at option value related to, for example, understanding the underlying statistical properties of what we do and the corresponding methodological properties as well.
Hey, John. Dave Judkins of Apt Associates. Enjoyed your talk. Thinking back to my days at the Census Bureau, since you're there now, I recall in the early 80s, some of the upper level management, your predecessors, got really enthused about Deming's work and insisted that all the mathematical statisticians watch his tapes. And I remember thinking at the time how discordant they were with the way the same people were actually managing the organization, in terms of the way people were evaluated, their performance, et cetera. Then about the same time, Chip Alexander had this idea about, you mentioned contentious and creative human beings, about maybe instead of having just one design team for some problems, we should have competing design teams. And just wondering what your ideas of management of change and creativity, whatever, have they changed, or what you're thinking now at the Census Bureau?
Well, that's another hour lecture right there, but I'll try to keep things relatively short. There are a lot of different ways in which to try to manage in what is especially in a very fluid environment, when you have something that's changing very rapidly. It can be very beneficial to have multiple groups of people looking at the same problem. And it can be also very useful in that context to say, be sure that in fact they understand they're all on the same team. Go back to what I said very briefly about treating the exercise as a positive sum exercise. If in fact you have multiple groups that effectively are treating a set of decisions essentially as a zero sum or a negative sum game, that can be very corrosive. But on the other hand, if you end up setting a tone of saying, we want several different groups of people to look at this because we know you have different skills, we know you have different perspectives on this, and we're doing everything we can, in fact, to explore all the dimensions of what we have here. Go back to what I was saying, for example, about thinking about very high dimensional performance measures that we have for quality, risk, and cost. It's going to be entirely natural that you're going to have different groups of people, for example, looking at different components related to quality, risk, and cost. But be sure you have a tone attached to that that says we're all working on this together. We all are trying to play a positive sum game here, to state it in quasi-decision theoretic terms. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Actually, I'm going to expand on that a little bit if we could. I exist as a fringe statistician. I'm in operations and management, and we mock young people a little bit sometimes for their short attention spans, but I'm trained in the 30 seconds of management update. I have 30 seconds to give an executive the idea of what I've been working on and so forth. And where I work with a very technical statistician, or where I sit in the presentations here, I can see that most of it goes way over even my head, and I'm not a statistician. How do you train yourself or others to communicate effectively, quickly, and in some ways, not to be derogatory towards executives, but dumb it down to the level that they can take it in quickly, or at least grab their attention, so that shortly thereafter you can actually have an expanded conversation on a topic?
Well, first of all, let me respond to what you were saying most recently about individuals who may have limited attention spans. Bear in mind that I've observed the same phenomenon you have, but I think we may misattribute it to, well, it's those other people over there who have the short attention span. It's very natural to say, I'm going to be paying a whole lot of attention to my area here. And in fact, I can love to go an enormous amount of depth on that. On the other hand, I may have and perhaps even perceive that there is no need for more than a superficial understanding of something else. Here's an example. If I have something that doesn't sound right with the engine on my car, I take it into the mechanic and I say, I'm hearing something, please get it fixed. If that mechanic were to give me, and I did in fact actually have this experience once a couple of decades ago, delivers an in-depth lecture on the underlying thermodynamics related to internal combustion engines, I may listen politely, but honest to goodness, I'm not going to absorb most of that. I have not had thermodynamics for well over 35 years now. I'm just not going to be able to absorb much of that at all. And on the other hand, if the mechanic ends up saying, replace that part right there, okay, I get it. We often compartmentalize in that way. And what we end up needing to say, go back to what I was discussing before about how do you pull together all these talents? What kind of training, for example, do you expect? You want to, in some ways, have a highly dispersed set of skills and say we're going to be spending a whole lot of time integrating that? Or do you have relatively small teams with essentially very deep training attached to each of those? That ties in with the communication question. You do certainly have to be able at some point to articulate to a broad set of people, for example, within your organization, but also externally. So, for example, if you say, go back to my consumer price index case, if you had 10 seconds to say, why do we have a consumer price index? The reality is that anybody involved with that is almost certainly going to say Social Security. If they're given another few seconds after that, they're going to say hundreds of billions of dollars in contract writers, price and inflation writers for contracts. That's what they're going to end up saying. If, in fact, they have a little bit more time, they will then start elaborating on, and furthermore, this is crucial, for example, for us to understand an enormous amount about what's taking place with productivity. And you see, if you use this price index over here, we can get this insight. If we use this other price index over here, we can get the other insight. But that's not the first sentence that you end up having. And it's very much a matter of trying to allocate mind share, allocate the information that you're trying to convey in a way that's proportional in some sense to the mind share that you have available. That also means you have to have an organization that effectively trusts people with a very high degree of delegation. Again, I trust my mechanic to say, you need to fix this part here. I could explain to you the fine details of thermodynamics related to this, but for the time being, the message is you need to replace that part. The same is true. And that high degree of trust means you need to foster that kind of culture, the highly collaborative culture, working on positive sum exercise that I was referencing before. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much again.